Welcome, everyone. I think we're not all here, but many of us are here. Others will be joining, I'm sure, as we get started. Um, I'm Laura Lacrane. I'm the board chair at Thank You Life. I have the honor of hosting tonight this fireside chat with Dr. Florian Birkmayer. I'm sure you'll find it fascinating. I've taken class with him and really love his work. So thank you for coming. Thank you for taking time out of your day to hear about his work and work he's doing with his wife with psychedelics and aroma. So I'm not sure all who's here because I don't have the gallery view, but I want to say thank you to all of you for your support in many different ways of Thank You Life and our mission to ensure that nobody gets left behind when it comes to the healing modalities of psychedelic-assisted therapy. Our mission and vision is to remove the financial barriers. As we know, it can be quite expensive to receive these therapies, and we're addressing that problem from many angles so that no one's left out. And I think many of you are part of that mission as well in your own lives and in your support of Thank You Life. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here tonight. Let's see. So I'd like to start with a little bit of grounding. We're coming from a busy days. It's afternoon or evening for most of us. And so just to take a moment to come into a common resonance of gratitude in the spirit of Thank You Life. So if you could all just either close your eyes or lower your gaze for a moment, just to begin to come into your body, to let go of the busyness of the day. And it's very useful to do that by following the breath. So I invite you to just pay attention to your breath for a moment and allowing yourself to release whatever doesn't need to be here with each exhale. And as you inhale, to feel that sense of gratitude for breath, for air, and the recognition that all beings live thanks to air and breath. So be with that breath, gratitude for the breath for a minute. And then feel your body, another way to come into presence for our time together, to pay attention to your body and its place on this earth. Maybe you're on a chair or on the ground, on a couch. Just really feel the gravity holding you and recognizing the beauty of this earth that holds not only humans, but all beings with so much generosity and abundance and care. So giving gratitude for our bodies and this body of earth that we get to live on. Now, in honor of our discussion today, I invite you to take a moment to bring into your mind's eye one of the most beautiful fruits of this earth, which is flowers. And just take a moment to imagine, let your imagination go. Maybe think of some of your favorite flowers and allow them to come into your mind's eye. Maybe you're even able to bring forth the aroma of that flower if you know it well. Maybe you're in a field of flowers with the colors and aromas all around you. Coming to mind the color, the texture, of course the smell, maybe even how that flower makes you feel as you call to mind the rose or the daffodil, passion flower, sunflower, Allow your imagination to be with all that beauty for a moment. And in that spirit of the flowers and in gratitude, I invite you to come back to our chat here. And if you have the ability to put it on gallery view for a minute so we can see all the flowers that we are, all the beautiful faces. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And yeah, now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Florian Birkmayer. Thanks for being here. He has an amazing history, actually. I learned that he first learned about essential oils from his grandfather in the 70s. It captured his imagination, and went into undergrad at Princeton, where he studied molecular biology, and then to medical school at Columbia, where I learned he was experimenting with essential oils for his concentration, studying all those medical texts, much to maybe the laughter of some of his peers. But it continued to capture his imagination, and Dr. Birkmayer went into psychiatry, sort of traditional psychiatric practice and addiction treatment. And at some point, I don't know the year, started to become a little disillusioned by the psychiatric profession and the inability to really help people with pharmaceutical drugs, and some people weren't responding to those treatments. And he actually began a ketamine therapy practice in 2011. And in that practice, he was able to bring in these essential oils and aromas and see how they could enhance and contribute to the psychedelic therapeutic experience with ketamine. And along with his wife, who's an herbalist, Cathy Skipper, they created an organization called AromaGnosis. And this is an organization to really study and promote and educate around these healing benefits of essential oils, including how to use them in concert with psychedelic-assisted therapy. So there are many more things I could say, but I'm so delighted in this unique and important niche that you're offering to us today. And I'm just going to hand it over to you. Is it okay if I call you Florian?
Please, please.
And yeah, take it away. Thank you again for being here.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Laura and Meredith and Kevin and Ronnie, for having me, and thank you to Thank You Life, and thank you to all of you for showing up. As I half-jokingly say, I can talk about this until I'm blue in the face, so I'm going to try and be brief. And it is, we're so distracted, we're pulled in so many different directions, so it's really special that we take this time. And I really appreciated Laura's meditation, because breath is really what connects us all. The first thing we do when we're born is we inhale. The last thing we do when we die is exhale. And what the air we breathe is made by the plants. And so for me, these volatile aromatic molecules that fly through the air are really, like, you could say, the neurotransmitters of the world soul. I'm reminded, there's a philosopher of nature, David Abram, who's written several books, and if you Google it or go on YouTube, there's a talk he gave, The Commonwealth of Breath. And that's really what it is. We're all sharing in breath, and it's what connects us all. And so your meditation really, I thought, beautifully reminded me of that. And also you mentioned the body, and that's, it's really about being here, about being immanent, being embodied, not being dissociated. And natural aromas are really powerful at that. I think in the invite there might have been a suggestion, if you have an essential oil, if you have it handy. I was thinking we could do it now just to continue on this beautiful meditation. If you have an essential oil or any sort of aroma that you really like handy, maybe you can bring it or grab it. If not, that's okay. Again, I liked what Laura said about imagining it. I've certainly had the experience where a scent will come to me and the oil or the plant isn't anywhere near. So I think one way that these plants communicate with us is really telepathically, you could say, and they're, instead of saying, hey, my name is you smell the smell. There isn't a good word for it. It's olfactory hallucination, but I think it's really a way for the plants to reach us in the spirit realm. So if you have an aroma handy, let's sort of build on the on what Laura did, and I'm going to be as my wife always says, I'm going to be gourmand about it. So I have a atlas cedar here, and I also have some neroli. And if you wanted to, I was thinking you could put in the chat either what aroma you have, or what aroma you're thinking of, or what your favorite aroma is. And just by way of explanation, the other thing you'll see me doing is using these perfume test strips. And they're a little prosaic, but they're really nice because, you know, the smell really dissipates from them. If for those of you who've seen the movie version of Perfume, there's this crazy scene where, you know, he puts the drop of something in something else, and then he puts it in a handkerchief, and then he waves the handkerchief through the air and smells the cloud. I don't have any handkerchiefs. But this is a great, you know, smelling an aroma from a bottle is really like looking at a painting through a straw, in my opinion. Meredith shared that she got lavender. We talked about that. Sorry, too many things. Ginger said sandalwood, Ryder lavender, Chris eucalyptus radiata, Ronnie of course ylang ylang. Oh, and Kevin also grabbed atlas cedar. It's and Michael also ylang ylang. This is great. Rose Otto V and Rich Rose. Well, this is one interesting thing is, you know, there's our intentionality, let's say, but in a way, I think we're also the plants are speaking through us. So the fact that these plants are saying, "Hey, I want to be part of the circle," I think that's why we have several of the same. And I can see myself getting excited and my mind wanting to take off. But let's just take a few moments. So, in the same vein as Laura beautifully is, still really feel your body grounded, seated. And as you inhale, you know, I was just rereading, or I was reminded of the quote from Genesis that God breathed life through our nostrils. So it's, you know, when we smell, it's really we're connecting with life. So just allow yourself to inhale the aroma, take a deep breath, exhale through your mouth. Ideally, instead of sort of forcing the breath, it's almost like observe your breath, like the tide in and the tide out. And as you smell the aroma, feel it spreading through your physical body, which is, you know, quite obvious for most of us, this, you know, our hands and legs and torso. And what you'll see is that the aroma will gravitate towards a certain area. It'll sort of bring attention to a part of your body that maybe is demanding some attention. So just follow the scent. And when it brings your awareness, your heart awareness to a particular area of your physical body, just make a note of it. There's no need to judge it or try to fix it or try to change it. And just, you know, we're all using different aromas, but just see how the aromas shift. You know, we already had the beautiful meditation from Laura, but just the aromas shift our awareness. They take us sort of out of our monkey mind, ego, into more of ourselves. And as you smell the aroma, as it enters you, as it brings awareness to certain parts of your physical body that you'll be holding in your heart awareness, now shift your awareness to your emotional body. Different people have different understandings of that. However that makes sense to you, just your awareness knows what it is. If you're not sure, you could imagine it as an invisible body that's a little larger than your physical body. And again, it's where all our emotions happen, the emotions we're aware of, the emotions we're not aware of. And again, allow the aroma as you inhale it, as you allow it to spread through your emotional body. It may bring your awareness to a particular emotional pattern that you may have been aware of or may not have been aware of. And as you become more conscious of this emotional pattern, again, there's no need to change it or fix it. Just make a note of it. And I'm sorry, we're going to go a little fast, but I think this is important. With your awareness now, shift your awareness to your mental body. Again, in whatever way that makes sense to you, and allow the aroma to make you aware of whatever mental patterns, thought patterns, preoccupations are happening right now. You may be aware of them. You may not be aware of them. I think of the mental body, some people think of it as, an invisible body that's larger than our physical and emotional bodies. I often think of it like a river of thought that we're usually swept along by. And now I invite you to just sort of sit by the bank of the river and watch the thoughts go by without being swept away. And a lot may be coming up, but again, in your awareness, in your heart awareness, which is that whole awareness where there's no judgment or labeling, open that awareness to your spiritual body. Again, however that makes sense to you. To me, it's often a landscape. And again, there's patterns in your spiritual body that the scent will bring your awareness to. Just going a little bit further, we beings, we're connected to everything around us through our breath, where we live. So allow the scent also to expand your awareness a little bit more to your loved ones around you, people around you, animals and plants and nature around you. Just sort of remember that we are deeply connected to this ecosystem. And then with this awareness, just sort of come back to our circle. And before I jump in, does anybody have anything that they want to share or something that's come up for them? I personally feel very altered in a good way, like very more here. And the nice thing about when we use aromas, this is sort of our hack for being on Zoom, very, very disembodied, dissociated, disconnected, but the aromas connect us. I feel there's like a shift in the room we're in, even though we're all over. So I just want you to pay attention to that shift in, I often say it's a different flavor of silence. Okay, anybody want to share, or should we just jump right in, and then there'll be plenty of time for question and answer. Oh yeah, thanks for sharing in the chat. Christine said it seems to clear the mind, and Christine, yeah, and eucalyptus does really do that. Again, often we think, this is really one of my intrinsic themes that I don't often verbalize. Often we think of essential oils as having very specific left brain purposes. Certain ones are good for rashes, antibacterial things. But this is really about the soul to soul connection, not so much what the plant does or the essential oil, but what it knows and what it's trying to tell us. And so there is it's, the word esoteric is maybe wrong, but there's layers of meaning that each of these aromas can teach us, especially aromas that we think we know. They keep they keep teaching us more and more. Right, I mentioned that the lavender reminds you of being cared for, nurtured, beautiful. So that's a hint about what I'm going to talk about. All these layers of communication, the sort of that deep sense of being cared for. Well, let me share my screen. It's a Google presentation, which I found those work quite well. Oops. I just got to change my screen a little bit. Let me start the slideshow and go like this. Okay, so again, the topic is using essential oils for psychedelic therapy, the work I do with my wife, Cathy Skipper, and at AromaGnosis. And first, again, I don't know your background, but let me quickly talk about what essential oils are. So a plant does actually not contain essential oils. Certain plants, not all of them, make volatile aromatic compounds. And when we distill them, the traditional methods is steam distillation, hydrodistillation, and there's other ways. The product that comes out is called an essential oil, and it's technically not an oil. It's not like olive oil. They are organic molecules, so they are hydrophobic. So when you distill them, they separate from water. So that's where the colloquial term oil comes from. But they're chemically quite diverse. So they're not oils in the strict sense. And just to put this in context, if we made a list together of how many different kinds of molecules you or I are made of, albumin in our blood and hemoglobin, and there's about 3,000 different molecules. Of course, we have a lot of some molecules and less of others, but some plants make between 20 and 50,000 different molecules. So they're these chemical powerhouses, these factories, and they evolved for a wide variety of purposes. The sort of more prosaic is, well, in the competition of evolution, and I think that's an oversimplification, plants are competing with fungi, bacteria, so a lot of these compounds are designed as sort of, you could say, like an immune system to fight bacteria and fungi and viruses. There's also, we know that aromas, because of, the volatile nature, is really useful because it allows plants to communicate at a distance. So there are many examples where if there's a stand of plants and one gets attacked by a predator, by an insect that eats it, it will release a volatile molecule to signal to the other plants, hey, I'm being attacked. And the other plants will react. They'll change their chemical composition so they're less palatable to the predator. But even more interesting than this intraspecies communication is transspecies communication. About 200 million years ago, this amazing feat of coevolution happened where plants evolved flowers and other ways to signal to attract pollinators. And that included, of course, volatile aromatic molecules. And, bees, which are the famous pollinators, can actually see, because they can see polarized light, some of these molecules will refract the light, so they can see extremely low concentrations to find their way to the plant that's emitting them. And in a way, you could say we are just glorified pollinators, that the plants are constantly interacting with us. And, the models of the brain are usually reflections of the technology of the times. In the Elizabethan age, people thought the mind was like a theater because that was the most, in European Elizabethan era, that was the most sophisticated technology. And now people say the mind's like a computer, but the brain is much more like a Wi-Fi network. It's constantly in communication. And that's what I realized. It's, we're glorified, or we're pollinators without really knowing we are. And so the real purpose of these molecules is to reconnect us. And I think you had a taste of that just now smelling it. So I call them the molecules of connectedness. And that's where I think there's a profound overlap with psychedelic molecules. And again, the reason I like essential oils is because, I can have a bottle here. This is Atlas cedar. Atlas cedar doesn't grow anywhere near me. And, like neroli is the flower of a particular species of citrus, and if it's the wrong time of year. So I like for me, natural aromas are better than artificial aromas, and the essential oils are just a really convenient way to connect with the soul of the plant. And one question I'll sort of pose without answering it too quickly is, why do we even have a sense of smell? It's not just, oh, the milk's gone off. I think we're in this deep relatedness with the larger than human world around us. And the sort of side note related to that is, why do we have dopamine and serotonin as neurotransmitters? Of course, you all know these neurotransmitters. These were plant molecules for millions of years before we used them. And I think it's not an accident. It's not just a case of evolutionary recycling. I think dopamine and serotonin are in us because we are of the same nature as the plants. And in a way, I don't want to anthropomorphize, but in a way, the plants wanted to make sure they could communicate with us through the dopamine pathways, serotonin pathway, and other pathways. Just quickly, how does conscious scent work? So at the top of our nose is something called the olfactory bulb, where there are nerves that go into the top of the nose, and and when we smell with our nostrils, the molecules sort of brush past all these receptors, and a particular molecule, scent molecule, will hit different receptors, and individual receptors react with different scent molecules. So you can think there's sort of like these almost like fingerprints light up, and that's what forms sort of the conscious scent perception. Another dimension of that is that, of course, we live in a world surrounded by different aromas, and so there's a sort of a foreground background effect. Like scent is encoded like a melody, in the same way that you can hear my voice even if we were in a crowded restaurant. The time progression of the scent, what you smell first, what you smell next, what you smell after that, is part of the way it's encoded. A couple of things about this is, I just recently delved into this, but the olfactory bulb, it's called cranial nerve number 1 also, but it's actually part of the brain, and it's inside the blood-brain barrier. So when we smell something, it hits us very directly. The other thing I'll get to in a minute is that it bypasses the thalamus. We'll talk about that. Now, the other part that I just want to mention is further on. So here's a slightly different diagram. The next step from the olfactory bulb, you can sort of see it in the center here. It's in the center of our brain. It's called the piriform cortex. And the reason that's important, as I'll mention again a little bit later, is the piriform cortex is also full of serotonin type 2A receptors, which are the classical agreed upon target of classical psychedelics such as LSD, psilocybin, DMT. So almost immediately, from the olfactory bulb, next step here from cortex, scent and psychedelics interact. And I've read a lot about this, and no one's really talking about this. They talk about the piriform cortex, especially in animals, but scent's more important seemingly, but no one's talking about the role in psychedelics. The point of this slide is really just to say that, as you all know, scent goes directly to the brain, to the limbic system, emotional associations, feelings, memories. It doesn't go through the thalamus. So I've already said this. So let me explain the thalamus a little bit. It's at the boundary between the brainstem and the cortex, and it's like an active filter. So the reason you're not feeling the clothes in your skin right now is because your thalamus filters out your sense of touch. So when someone touches you, you feel it. But something that's always touching you, like your clothes, you don't. And as I already mentioned, if we were in a crowded restaurant, you could still hear my voice, even if there was a lot of noise around. Olfaction is different. It goes right into the limbic system. The other thing I want to say, I've just talked about conscious scent perception so far, and there's a family of genes called olfactory receptors. And we actually have over 400 genes in our genome coding for them, and they exist in every organ of our body. So when you feel a smell, when you're in the presence of a smell, you're not just consciously perceiving it, you're really perceiving it with every cell in your body. And again, just to think about 400 genes is not genetic garbage. I mean, that's a lot. And I always say, if each of these receptors was like a letter in an imaginary alphabet, imagine the poetry you could write with if you had 400 letters instead of 26 letters. So that doesn't fully do it justice, but most of our scent perception is unconscious. I wanted to quickly talk about essential oils, how they work on us. So they bypass the intellect, as I think we all had a taste of. And there's a biographical dimension. One of you mentioned sort of comfort and calm, and sometimes we'll get very vivid memories, associations. The master of this was really Marcel Proust, a 19th century French writer who eats a cookie as an adult, and taste is mostly smell in the taste or scent of the cookie reminds him of a cookie he had as a young boy. And all these memories come flooding in, and he writes a 3,000-page thinly veiled autobiographical novel based on the scent memory. And he actually, at the beginning of the book, talks about how scent triggers these memories in a different way than when I ask you what's 2 + 2, or if I ask you to remember someone's phone number. It's a different experience. Then there's the cultural dimension. This is culture bound, but if we say Thanksgiving or Christmas or even summer or spring, there's particular scent memories or scent objects that you'll think of, and then there's another layer beyond that, which to me is the archetypal layer, the ancestral layer. And I've experienced this firsthand, because when we've taught around the world, in Brazil, in Taiwan, in Europe, all over the States, people from very different cultural backgrounds with these alive essential oil aromas, people have very reliable reactions that are not something, it's often aromas they've never smelled before. So to me, this is something archetypal. It's not based on prior learning or association. And I think that archetypal level is also why aroma was used as spiritual technology. Basically, practically all spiritual traditions use aroma. In the Torah, there's the mention of the ketoret, a very precise recipe of an incense that's only supposed to be burned in the temple. And when you smell it, similar to when we smelled a few minutes ago, that particular smell is supposed to make you feel and remind you that you're in the presence of the divine. And what better way, instead of thinking, oh, spirituality or somewhere out there, saying, no, I'm feeling it with my body right here. I'm in the presence. I love that. And, the ancient Egyptians were the masters of this. Just one example is that the first thing that happens in the origin of the world in ancient Egypt is that they've got their genders backwards. So Mother Sky and Father Earth get together, and their child is the blue lotus. And the blue lotus is both a psychedelic and an aromatic plant. So that's the first thing that happens for the ancient Egyptians. And there's examples from all over. And in my slides, there's lots of links that I don't want to get bogged down in. So how do essential oils work on us? Really quickly, they disrupt the default mode network. The default mode network, we'll talk about it in a minute. This is, of course, a level of synergy with psychedelics. Olfaction also causes neuroplasticity, the formation of new brain pathways and new brain cells. That's another level in which they synergize. But it's really, I think, much more, and I'm going to geek out a little more on the way I conceptualize the evidence, but it's really about the soul-to-soul communication, that aliveness, that, though be beyond the chemical analysis of an essential oil, what it means to me, what a good oil does is it moves me. There's essential oils I've smelled and I start crying. And that sort of being touched by that molecule of connectedness is really what it's, or where the rubber meets the road, what makes a good quality oil for me. I feel like we might run out of time, so I'm going to skip this. But bottom line is, first of all, new brain cells form continuously in our olfactory system. And, my sense of smell has gotten better just from working with oils, being better able to discern it. And this has been, smelling oils in something called olfactory training has been used to help people who've there sense of smell. There were studies before COVID and with COVID. And one of the possible mechanisms of actions is oxytocin, which is, the feel-good hormone that has been shown to cause new brain cells and pathways to form and is increased by aromas and also certain psychedelics. And I mentioned the default mode network. I don't want to get too bogged down. Maybe you've heard of it. It's, the network in our brain that it was discovered when they said to people, don't think of anything in particular and measure their activity in the MRI scanner. And we've all experienced it. If you're driving to the store or to work or a place you've been 100 times, you get there and you don't even remember the drive, like you've been on autopilot. So that's how it was first discovered. And it's been shown to be involved in a lot of psychopathology, depression, PTSD, OCD, anxiety, substance abuse, schizophrenia. And the idea is that it's these very habitual programs that run that sort of they put us in a rut without us even knowing we're in a rut. And sometimes I think it's controversial, but the evidence is there. But our ego, our conscious story of ourselves, this is who I am, is really just a program running in the default mode network. I can share the slides, but there is actually a variety of studies about the physiological and psychological effects of aromas. The one thing I'll mention sort of as within the emerging underground of psychedelic therapy and research, the use of aromas is sort of the underground's underground. And Matt Johnston, in his study on psilocybin for smoking cessation, actually used black pepper essential oil based on a study that was done in the 90s. It's not talked about much in his writings, but they were using aromas already. And so let's get to that. I think I read the slides that were, or the video that was at the beginning of the presentation. I really feel a deep alignment with Thank You Life's mission about, this new treatment, because our conventional treatments don't work. And that's what pushed me into sharing aromas with my clients a long time ago, is because the conventional treatments really are extremely limiting. And I think with my experience with ketamine already in 2011, it seemed like natural to use aromas right away. And we'll talk a little bit about how I do that. But this is not just, aromas smell good. And of course, they're calming and relaxing. There's actually a number of dimensions or ways of conceptualizing where, to me, this means that there's really good evidence how aromas and psychedelics synergizes. So I mentioned the default mode network. I'm sorry if I didn't do it justice, but both aromas and psychedelics disrupt the default mode network. The idea is when we're in pathological states, when we're really stuck in ego, we're sort of in this deep rut. And whether it's psychedelics or aromas, the rut sort of gets flattened. There's different ways to explain that. Both of them bypass the intellect, which again is really just a program running in the default mode network. Both psychedelics and aromas can trigger neuroplasticity. I already mentioned that there's this area in the brain, the piriform cortex, that gets the input from our olfactory bulb directly, and is also full of serotonin type 2A receptors. And again, if two signal, if this aromatic and psychedelic molecules meet in this area of the brain, there must be something happening. And let me spend a little more time on the piriform cortex. So in rats and dogs and animals where they admit that the sense of smell is more important, of course it's very important with us, but we're kind of blind to it. The piriform cortex is also called the olfactory association cortex. And in the same way that, your visual perception of the world is really put together in the visual association cortex, I think including us, but also especially rats and dogs and animals like this, they really form their world through how they smell. And there's actually a study, and I think I took the reference out but even we form our perception of time and space through olfactory input. And I think that's where the effects of psychedelics are really interesting. There's also these fascinating structural similarities that I'll have hopefully a little time to talk about. And then I'll just shout out to the entourage effect. I dug into that. To me, it made sense, and it turns out it's sort of a possibly pseudoscientific term from the medical cannabis industry. But the idea that there are these emergent phenomena when you combine aromas and psychedelics, and THC, the terpenes in various strains of cannabis, it's the cannabis industry decided a while ago not to call them the essential oils because that sounds too hippie. So what they call terps or terpenes are really aromatic molecules that have been quite more and more understanding has been developed about how they synergize with cannabinoids, and there's other efforts how they synergize with psychedelics. We've already talked about the soul-to-soul communication. Again, I think the quality is extremely important. Otherwise, if it's a mass-produced scent or a synthetic scent, there isn't really a soul of the plant behind that. And I think that aromas allow us to get out of our ego more, out of our intellect, to surrender more and have a more enhanced psychedelic experience. And also during and especially after, and I would also argue before, allow us to really integrate more deeply. When we smell the aroma, especially afterwards, I think it makes it more real. I think we remember our insights, not just intellectually, but with more of ourselves, let's say. I wanted to talk a bit about the structural relationship. So first, a little bit of context. Of course, both aromatic molecules and most psychedelic molecules evolved in plants, and I know fungi aren't plants, and of course there's the Sonoran Desert toad, but plants were on the earth for millions of years before most animals. Even ketamine is a natural molecule. I don't know if you know about this study, but ketamine was synthesized in the 60s, patented or FDA approved in 1970, and only 4 years ago now it was found in the fungus in the Brazilian rainforests, which to me makes sense. We can talk about that. And there is a long history of aromas in psychedelic ceremonies. You may have heard of perfumeros in South America, agua de Florida with ayahuasca ceremonies, and Palo Santo and sage and sweetgrass in Native American church ceremonies. And this book, Plant of the Gods, which was by Schultes, Hoffman, and Dretsch, came out many years ago. There was a newer edition, again, many years ago now. But when you read it, it's all about, this plant has an essential oil. So in a way, they, knowingly or not, this book is a compendium, an attempt to assemble a thorough list of all the psychoactive plants, and many of them also have aromas. So again, there's this coevolution. And this, to me, I think it's fascinating. Many of you may be familiar with Sasha Shulgin, who rediscovered MDMA, synthesized hundreds of psychedelic molecules himself. And in Pikal, his first major book of his experiments, in a footnote, he talks about just sort of his genius was they could just rattle these things off. He's like, I can think of 10 essential oils, and if you just change them around in the most minuscule way, they become psychedelic molecules. And he ends his footnote by saying nature is trying to tell us something. The most famous example is on the left here, the saffrol, which is in sassafras and a number of other plants. And if you look, I put a red circle around it. So the core of it, the indole, the larger part of the molecule is the same, but if you just change the side, when there's just a corner, it means it's a carbon molecule. So when you change from a carbon molecule to a nitrogen molecule, it goes from saffrol to MDA and MDMA. And this is why saffrol you can't buy saffrol. It's a controlled substance, because the DEA knows that if you're buying saffrol, we're probably trying to make MDA and MDMA. But saffrol is an aromatic. Of course, it has, like the aromas we just smelled, has psychoactive effects, but not as popular as MDMA and MDA. And the other example that's a little more obscure, but just to prove the point that this is not an isolated example, Cathy and I, some years ago, distilled a local plant here in northern New Mexico and started having a psychedelic experience. And we looked into it, and that plant contains a lot of what's called L-amycin. And if you look, L-amycin, again, extremely closely related to 3,4,5-trimethylamphetamine. That's a bit of an obscure molecule, certainly one that Shulgin synthesized. But the other very famous molecule that it's very closely related to is mescaline. And again, there are, psychoactive cacti south of us that contain mescaline. So again, nature's trying to tell us something. Just really quickly, I don't know what your background is, what your interest is. So in a way, I don't want to really, I could talk about how to use it, but maybe that's too focused. Maybe I'll see what else to share. So we also have some experience with psilocybin that we can talk about. The big difference is really with more classical molecules like psilocybin, like LSD or mescaline, the duration is generally quite long, several hours. And so you can use more than one aroma. I generally only use one or two at a time, but over the course of a session, you might end up using 10 aromas. And the other difference with ketamine, which of course is sort of the psychedelic gold rush, a lot of ketamine clinics have been popping up, is the traditional use of ketamine is intravenously, intramuscularly. I always used it intramuscularly because it was just very easy to inject someone. It's very brief and it's very inward. It's very dissociative. So I don't, during the ketamine session, will say to someone, oh, what's going on? Here's an aroma. I want them to go inward and really surrender to the journey. So usually based on the intention, I'll give them 1 or 2 aromas for the duration of the brief journey. And because of the inwardness, the role of the sitter with ketamine is really just sort of to hold the space and behold. With other less dissociative psychedelic molecules and with longer time, sometimes there's you need to be a little more interactive. And I mean, the whole what is the role of the sitter is a whole class unto itself. But again, aromas are really helpful for helping people when they get stuck or they're afraid. When they first start feeling that altered state, you might feel their defenses going up, and the aromas just allow them to surrender very deeply. As I mentioned, I like using sense strips just because it's very easy to control. If someone can bring it closer, smell it more, and if they don't like the aroma, they can, or if they want to take a break, they can move it further away. One thing I think that's important that guides the selection of essential oils is general intention or intentionality. And then there's a question of what if the client doesn't like the oil? And I always say that whether you have a very strong positive or a strong negative reaction, both of those are interesting doorways, saying, okay, what is it that this aroma is trying to tell you? If someone's like, I can't really smell it, I don't feel anything, that might be a message from your nervous system and the aroma saying that's not the aroma for today. You can use the same oil repeatedly. And I carried a bottle of sandalwood essential oil in my pocket for many years, and I do that for shorter durations now with different oils. But if you keep smelling the same aroma, it'll teach you many different things. What else? Well, this is another important concept that, I mentioned the holistic model of the psyche. We touched on the meditation, our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies. And it's not just the clients, it's also ourselves if we're in the role of the guide or the therapist of the sitter. And we really have to look at what's coming up for us. The term wounded healer was actually coined by Jung, who was one of my influences back in the 50s in one of his last essays, where any treatment that probes it all deeply really means for the guide, the therapist, things will come up that need to be examined. This is a diagram from James Hollis about all the different interactions. There's the conscious interaction. James Hollis is a Jungian analyst, so the words are very limited, but there's a conscious interaction between the healer and the client. But in the shadow of the healer is their own woundedness, and in the shadow of the client is their own inner healer. And by the time someone says, okay, I want to see a healer, whether for psychedelic therapy or anything really, they've usually lost touch with their inner healer. And this is, in certain psychedelic trainings, they talk about trust your inner healing intelligence, which to me, again, it's lip service. It can become a buzz phrase. It's really a whole lifelong practice. And the best way to practice is not to tell the client, oh, you have to trust your inner healer, but really for us as the guide, therapist, healer, to commit to looking at what's in our own shadow. That's the only way through harmony or correspondence or resonance that the client's invited to explore their own unconscious. And the aromas, again, are really powerful because it's so easy to say, oh, I know what's going on. My intellect's telling me this. And the aroma can really open the door to our own inner woundedness. This is interesting. This is the second to last thing I'll talk about before we open it up for Q&A. So this is the top of the Hildesheim altarpiece. It's in the town of Hildesheim in Germany. I think it's from the 12th century medieval. And so this is at the top, Adam and Eve with the serpent, with the tree of knowledge. And the background, of course, very much looks like a fly agaric, and Carl Ruck and others have read this and implied, and they have, and even Hoffman himself and others felt that the psychedelic symbolism, the fly agaric was widespread all over Europe. Its psychedelic potential was well established. It may have already been the ancient soma. And what the serpent, and the idea is, I think it's in I can't remember the book now, but a book came out recently. But the idea is that the tree of knowledge might have been a psychedelic that helped our ancestors. I mean, this is just a symbolic story, evolve. The interesting analogy is that Kilindi E, who was an amazing psychedelic pioneer, said that, you know, in Africa, when our antecedents emerged out of the jungles into the savannah, the psilocybin species at the time were the size of dinner plates. And again, psilocybin is the only psychedelic you don't really have to prepare. You can just eat it raw. And so the idea that a mushroom of some sort, the other line of reasoning is the stoned ape hypothesis by Terence McKenna. But what's really important here, bottom line, is in some version of the gospel, it says, and you will be like God. When you eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, you will be like God and know good and evil. And again, that to me is a more visceral reminder, again, of the necessity of us looking at ourselves so that we don't unconsciously perpetuate, you know, good and evil, that we don't perpetuate unconsciousness. Just real quick, we could talk more about it. There's a blog post, and I could put some of this in the chat. I put together a kit of 5 essential oils with a 90-page manual, so you can get started if you're working with people or for yourself. We have a monthly aromatic circle, which is specific for people interested in combining aromas with psychedelic therapy. We also have an aromatic journey where everybody who signs up, we mail them the same oil and then we meditate together. It's a guided meditation with a particular oil. And the idea is really to get to know this particular aroma more deeply, but to develop a practice of how to connect more deeply with aromas. And a class we've taught several times now, we're going to teach it again the weekend of September 14th and 15th, Essential Oils for Psychedelic Therapy. So right now it's just sort of a brief version of that, but in that class we go much more deeply. Let me turn the slides off and open it up for questions. Slides are off, right? You can see me. Thank you. So, questions. I just, my chat was obscured. Ginger asked about what was the New Mexico plant you experimented with. It was yerba manza. I'll put it in the chat. It's a endemic plant here. It grows along desert rivers. We make an essential oil from it, but you know, which is how we discovered the L-amycin. People traditionally would tincture it, and when you tincture herbs, they generally don't have a smell, so you don't discover it. Oh yeah, I haven't turned them off. Okay, sorry, picked the wrong thing. Here we are. Now the slides are off. Thanks, Rich. Yeah, just email me, Rich. I know you have to go. What else? Your slides are still on. Thank you, Ronnie, for the link. Jean, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, I'm staying off camera today. I'm a little under the weather, but because the olfactory, the aromas hit the part of the brain that's also activated by psychedelics, is it possible to use aromas, essential oils, to kind of like prime the pump, as it were, to kind of start to activate that part of the brain before a psychedelic journey? Does you think it potentiates a fuller or deeper journey using aromas before you even imbibe or ingest? And would it matter which essential oils you chose in that case?
Well, that's a beautiful question. So let me, in terms of which essential oils, the number one thing is really, are they alive? And then I always say it's better to have like 5 good friends than 200 acquaintances. And that's why I came up with the kit. So I would work with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 oils and really work with them yourself, a la wounded healer, so that you have this deep relationship, and then you'll get an intuitive hit. You might just smell something and say, okay, this is the oil for right now. And for right now, so the aliveness and that relationship is more important than a particular oil. In the kit, I put in rose because it's really heart opening, and often people at the beginning are anxious or very sort of intellectual. So to open the heart's really good. Another oil in the kit is labdanum. which is really good for shadow issues. Another oil in the kit is something called galbanum, which is actually what the resin, not the essential oil, is in the ketoret. And galbanum is very much about committing to the path. So when people have insights or realize they have to change something in their life, the galbanum sort of says, okay, no more wishy-washy, time to move. There's two other oils in the kit. One is vetiver, which the wild vetiver is called rucus, and that's really grounding, which is generally good when people come back from a psychedelic experience. But as a side note, as you can tell, I love making things complicated. Many of us are very dissociated, both from traumas, which dissociation is a natural response to trauma, but also our society is very dissociative. I mean, look at us. Here we are, talking heads on the screen, and we are constantly in our devices. So I think some people are so chronically dissociated that for them, the experience of being embodied is actually a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And so I think there's a role of vetiver or other grounding aromas even during a psychedelic experience. The other aroma, just to finish the story, is helichrysum, which is really good for buried emotional traumas. Sort of the mantra is allowing ourselves to cry the tears we've never allowed ourselves to cry. And to get to the gist of your question, I think it's really good in preparing beforehand when you're talking about, well, what are you hoping to get out of it? What questions to answer, assessing the person. And again, I think intentions or intentionality is important, that you can practice similar to how we practiced at the beginning. If someone smells oils, that's sort of just, okay, just allow the oil to connect with you, allow it to change you. That familiarity with learning how to smell, I think, is good and helps people's intentions to be more holistic. And then when they encounter the smell during the psychedelic experience, in a way, the pump's been primed already, as you said. And then especially afterwards, I wasn't really that mindful of it initially, but I'd have clients with these scent strips, and they're really terrible. The scent only lasts for a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes, but I would have clients take them home, and even with the residue, which is often just a ghost of a scent, it would allow them to integrate on their own. This was with ketamine. So I've become much more mindful of using aromas in the integration phase, so that when you're brought through that smell into that immanent state, that's really, to be embodied, to be immanent is what we need to change, to live the change that the psychedelic experience may have revealed to us. And that's the other thing, is it's, even the word psychedelic is, I really like Humphrey Osmond, who was the guy who coined this term, but I like the word ecodelic even more, because it's really about reconnection. Both psychedelics and aromas reconnect us to the larger than ego. They reconnect us to parts of ourselves that are in the shadow, they reconnect us to each other, and they reconnect us to nature. And that's getting more attention now. And I think that reconnection is a really important part of integration. And the other thing I'll say is, you can have that experience just from working with aromas, and you can work with aromas more or less every day, whereas I think psychedelic experiences are special and need to be special, and not something we can or should do every day. Hopefully I answered your question even a little bit. Okay, thanks, Ronnie, for putting in.
Yes, you did. That was great, thanks. And I have the kit, and I love the aromas. And could I'm doubled up here. Lavender is so prevalent, and I was just up in Washington State at a lavender field and bought a couple little, few different essential lavender oils. And I'm wondering if you could just say one or two things about the power of lavender.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say that I had a bias against lavender for a while, and I think that's because it was so mass produced. And so we have to be careful about sort of the biographical associations, I mean, which honestly has never happened. The biographical worry is like, oh, my grandmother smelled of lavender and she beat me, and I've never seen that. So I think generally the biographical associations of scents are quite holistic, let's say. And lavender is, it's often called the mother aroma because it will tie other aromas together. Lavender is from the Latin lavere, to wash. And it's not just, it makes your laundry smell nice and antibacterial. I think it really has a very cleansing, centering effect. And this is something, with conventional meds, calming also means sedating. If you take Xanax or lorazepam, you're going to be calmer, but you're also going to be sedated. And being more alert, caffeine or stimulant, Ritalin or Dexedrine, you're going to be more alert, but you're also going to be more jittery. And that's not true. Lavender will make you more alert. You'll be more receptive, but at the same time, you'll be calmer. And that's some of those different flavors of silence I talked about. There's this almost meditative state we enter when we smell an aroma, but we're just really open and present and calm and not jittery. So I think my personal story is really that I overlooked lavender for a long time, but I use it more and more again now because it is so versatile. Sorry, that's a very ego-driven word, but I've learned not to knock lavender anymore because it has a lot up its sleeve. Other questions, comments?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's partly a comment, I guess. I remember something that I really remembered from our discussion a while back was when you were talking about that the scent doesn't necessarily have to be a wonderful smelling essential oil. And you mentioned a time where a client was very stuck in their process and you brought ketchup. And the ketchup was enough to spark a childhood memory, and I don't know, maybe I'm making this up, but this is what I remembered. And so I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about that if there are other examples or times when you might use another scent that aren't necessarily in your 5 kits?
Well, I'm having a senior moment, Laura, about the ketchup. Someone told me the ketchup story, and so I can't take credit for it. Okay. And it's like that scent memory. It's almost at the tip of my tongue. But yes, I think I like essential oils because they're very powerful. They're very convenient. I have access to plants from around the world, which, I'll just asterisk sustainability. There's certain oils I don't work with anymore because the plants that they come from are endangered. But I think any scent that's alive, we have a beautiful cardamom essential oil, but cardamom as a cooking spice is just really powerful. And I sort of feel like going against it, but coffee is mostly aromatherapy. When you grind the coffee, yes, there's caffeine in it. There's, I think, 400 different molecules in coffee, and a large part of it is the aromas in the coffee that have trained us. We don't really need the caffeine, even though we've trained ourselves to think we need it. I think that, in the psychedelic therapy world, there's a long tradition. Like Leo Zeff would bring a flower to people. And again, there are non-aromatic flowers and aromatic flowers. So you can use different aromas. I just, I'll say one of my biases is towards the more archetypal aromas where the biographical is less important. I have colleagues who are really interested in the biographical, and there's certainly something to be said for that. But let's go back to labdanum. It's the resin of the cistus ladanifer plant, which is a shrub in the Mediterranean. Most people have never smelled it. And just as a side note, there are people who make an essential oil from the whole plant, but it's quite different than the essential oil made from the resin. The ancient Egyptians already used it. So some of you may have heard about labdanum in modern men's beard products because the Egyptian pharaohs would put it in their beard, but the stylized Egyptian beards were not beards in the modern sense. To me, they were like scent strips, really, that you'd have labdanum always in front of your nose in this beautiful device so that you would, in a way, the job of the pharaoh was to do shadow work. The pharaoh is an interesting transition in the archetype from the king as the wicker man, that's the sacrificial lamb, to the king as the worldly power. The pharaoh's most important job was to die, and Osiris, the archetype of pharaoh, dies, gets dismembered. His twin sister wife puts him back together again, and this is the story of his life, or his spiritual apotheosis is deeply linked with labdanum. All this to say that most of the time when we have people smell labdanum, they haven't smelled it before, and they get a very deep reaction. So that's my bias, but I think it's, and there's I'm still trying to figure out the ketchup thing, and I sort of, it's like it's somewhere in my mind, but I can't access it. Maybe I just need to smell the right aroma. But I heard a story of a kid who was in a coma for many years, and then what woke him up was the smell of Old Spice. That there's a blog post I wrote that mentioned that in passing. So again, I think we're blind to the sense of smell. We use analogous words. I mean, the only word, I like the word petrichor, which is the smell of rain on the wet soil. And this word was only invented in the 80s to describe that smell. And then somewhere else I read recently, it's the only pure scent word we have. Everything else is like, oh, it smells like cherries, or it's like this or that. It's all by proxy, by analogy to something else. There are languages that are much more rich in the, like, those stereotype is the Inuit have 30 words or 50 words for snow. There are languages where scent is more honored. And one of my hopes is that we just become more conscious of how scents constantly reconnect us. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
thank you.
Other comments or questions?
I have a couple of questions.
Please.
First, I saw on one of your slides, you talked about rose for anxiety and depression. Can you expand on that a little bit, or?
Sure. So that's actually a study, and I'll share the slides so we don't get bogged down. But first of all, rose has figured prominently, the rose as a plant in no small part because of its scent in many different spiritual traditions. So of course there's the Eurocentric Christian tradition, and even the Rosicrucians, the rose and the cross. So there was all this language about the rose garden, this sort of protected space when we're in a more spiritual realm. There's the old expression sub rosa, which is Latin for under the rose, because secret societies would hang a rose in the ceiling saying everything that's discussed here stays here. So there's many layers of spiritual, more than symbolism, really spiritual wisdom about the power of the rose. And, it's used in many different cultures. It's not just used in Christian Eurocentric traditions, it's used in India. And then because it's so well known, you could say, or popular, they've actually done studies with it. And so there are studies that rose, I'm thinking of several different studies now where they measure anxiety in different ways. They've certainly measured it with animals and certain measures of distress that animals have. But I think there's also studies in humans and subjective rating scales of how much anxiety they feel in different settings. I think there's a study in women about to give birth, being anxious about giving birth. There's, I think, people receiving surgery. But so to me, the science is helpful, but sometimes I feel it really strips away a lot of the wholeness of it, our soul-to-soul connection. But there is certainly a number of studies now on how rose can really help anxiety. And practically, we use, rose is actually surprisingly challenging to make a good essential oil from. First of all, it has a very low yield, so you need like 7 tons of rose petals, which is hectares or acres full, to get a pint of essential oil. And so there have been different attempts to make that more efficient. And rose is a highly adulterated, you'll find rose oil and it's adulterated. But one traditional method to capture fragile aromas is something called an attar, which is a Persian word that made it to the word and the technology made it to India. And what they do very traditionally is to take sandalwood essential oil and distill the rose petals into the sandalwood oil. And so the sandalwood has this unique property of sort of going into the background. Of course, it has its own aroma, but when you make the attar, that aroma goes into the background. And to me, it's almost like the sandalwood is like cupped hands in which then the fragile florals really come alive. And so if you measure it, if you analyze it, most of the oil in the attar is sandalwood oil, and there's only tiny amounts of either rose, or they use it for other fragile, like tuberose or so after years of searching for the best rose, the work we've done, the rose attar with the sandalwood, sort of provides an envelope, so to speak, for the rose. I think it makes it last longer. Like the pure rose essential oil smell, they hit you very fast and they dissipate very quickly. And the sandalwood makes it come on more slowly and it lingers a lot more. And I think that's really good for anxiety in general. And I think also for the anxiety when it comes to psychedelic therapy. I mean, nothing with psychedelic therapy should be by default, but if you're not sure about what aroma to use, and I have colleagues, the only aroma they use is rose attar because it's just so hard opening, and then people can really surrender to the experience. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, thank you. And then I took a brief glance at your website, and I saw there was a program on menopause, and I was just curious from a personal standpoint if you use scents for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really Cathy's work now. And, AromaGnosis used to be sort of this umbrella website, and we realized we had the desire a while ago to have a standalone website for her work with women, because she realized that menopause is really a woman's shamanic initiation. And so that she has a model of the process that evolved out of our work together and uses aromas with that. So in the different offerings, for example, there's a 9-week class and participants get a kit of, I don't know how many different oils, 8 or 9 different oils with the class. So it's what I realized. I always talk about the aromas, but as important as the aroma is really a holistic model of the psyche, both of the components, the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual body, and other layers we haven't even talked about, but also the processes. So that, personal growth is challenging. And if we have digestion is a messy process, but we understand it because, of what it does, or respiration. And so there are natural processes of the unconscious psyche that when we recognize them, I think we're more willing to embrace them, and the aromas can help that, but also having the framework helps that.
Thank you.
Great. Well, what else? Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Mary.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I think often in the plant world, there's such an emphasis on learning plants visually. And when I take people out in my garden, it's always crushed plant and smell. To learn plants by scent, it's very powerful. But that's an aside. I was just wondering if you could talk some about the difference between what it was like doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy without aroma and what you noticed with aroma. And maybe I'm not entirely clear that you ever didn't not use aromas, but yeah. I was just wondering if you could talk about what you've, essentially, what you noticed and what now is like to work with aromas. And
well, so I worked with aromas long before I started using ketamine in 2011. So it was rare that a client said, absolutely not, I don't want aromas. But both in my experience, which is very biased towards working with aromas for all the reasons that I spelled out, but also from a lot of my colleagues, I think what we're really looking for is some way to make the experience more transformative. Often people will resist, or people will be overwhelmed. They don't know what to make of it, and so I think the aromas reconnect us. They reconnect us to, when we're confronted, what psychedelics really are, bottom line, is they're like a truth serum or a mirror of those parts of ourselves that we haven't seen yet. And sometimes that's really hard to accept, saying, wow, I didn't know I was doing this, or I didn't know this was a pattern in me. And I think aromas really, they bring us to that larger awareness. We're like, okay, yeah, that I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe I acted that way, or I thought that way, but it's okay. It's part of this larger self. And again, that ecodelic consciousness. So I think The difference is that there are now tendencies to make it a product. I think a lot of the academic research looks at them as these random molecules. They're not random. Like I said, these aromatic molecules and psychedelic molecules evolved for communication, and we are part of this much larger network of connectedness of consciousness, non-human consciousness. And I think the aromas enhance that connectedness, that's why I like the word ecodelic, because that sense of connectedness to me is one of the most important experiences you can have. Psychedelics are not about, I saw some crazy visuals. That's a side effect as far as I'm concerned. What's really is that sense of awe, that sense of humility, that sense of there's all these beings I'm in deep connection with, and I think aromas really help that.
It's
Writer.
It's piggybacking a little bit off of what you were just talking about, and also it's kind of hard to phrase because it's all in flux right now, but where do you foresee the research and development of these treatment modalities going in terms of do you think it's really going to be driven by research done in universities? Just kind of wondering where that's going to be heading.
Well, that's a question I think about a lot. I mean, it's funny because when it was underground, fully underground, let's say, or the people in it were much more in it for the soul of it, not for the money. And there's someone coined this. I just recently, someone termed the first corporadelic. And there's just sort of to see the pulse. There's I think it's called Psychedelic Alpha. It's an email newsletter for investors, and to take these revolutionary molecules, and I don't even like the word molecules, they're plant teachers or spirit teachers, but to sort of productify them, to me, is almost more disrespectful and worse than the prohibitionist policies. I mean, I'm glad prohibition is hopefully ending, but in a way you can see the power of that in what happened recently with the FDA advisory panel or advisory commission, ADCOM, advisory committee, decision against MDMA-assisted therapy. There's sort of, on the one hand, this almost cultish gung-ho-ness, and some people would say a premature victory lap at the Psychedelic Science Conference last year. It's almost like the FDA was made to not have a choice. And I hate this expression, but I haven't, since I've heard it, I have, but it's like the unconscious, both the individual and collective unconscious says, oh, you think this is a shoe-in? Hold my beer. So the fact that the people that asked for the advisory committee hearing even got heard, amazing, beautiful. I don't think they expected that they would be heard. And then the explanations that the people on the advisory committee gave, it was like Jungian psychotherapy. It's like Jung had this quote, which he said after the atomic bomb was dropped, is the world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human psyche, the unconscious. I mean, the unconscious and the shadow have derailed this. And so on the one hand, I've been very worried about the corporadelic developments. And again, I think what bothers me most about the academic research is to treat it as there's this random molecule. I listened to some presentation a few months ago saying, oh yeah, psilocybin was evolved by these fungi as or something. I think it's much more purposeful than that. Again, it's all about connectedness, communication, and that ideological randomness that the academic, here's this random molecule and we have to do these studies in this certain way. There's so many layers which that's really problematic. Even the idea that you have to have a disease and sort of drink the Kool-Aid of the DSM-5, let's say, of these diagnostic categories and these rating scales. The rating scales and what these studies show, there's a beautiful quote by Humphrey Osmond who said in relation to psychedelic therapy back in the 50s, not everything that's important can be measured and not everything that can be measured is important. So, and I think so, there's headlines recently that the ketamine bubble's bursting, the MDMA Advisory Committee decision. These, to me, are actually hopeful signs. I wrote a Substack a couple of weeks ago that there's a golden shadow to this. There's something happening that this ego-driven, corporadelic, academic worldview that's really dominating the discourse. There's an interesting Andy lecture from 10, 15 years ago called Mad Thoughts on Mushrooms, where he does a discourse analysis. And, when there are different discourses about it, you can have the corporadelic discourse, the academic discourse. On the other end of the spectrum is sort of the animistic discourse that psychedelic plant teachers are really conscious beings that want to help us evolve. That's sort of, that's my camp. But the academic and corporadelic discourses silence the other discourses. They're not neutral. They have a very silencing function. People will say, oh, isn't there a double-blind randomized controlled study for that? As if that's the end of the story. And so I think that the hoopla recently with the MDMA Advisory Committee, with the backlash against ketamine, I think it's good. There was just an article in The Guardian that I saw today from two psychedelic researchers saying, we're going about this all wrong. So I'm cautiously optimistic that there is a golden shadow here, that hopefully things are going to take an unexpected turn of events, and we'll hear much more from indigenous voices, traditional practitioners, women, the wisdom keepers of these traditions. Even so, of course, in many traditions, women were the wisdom keepers of the psychedelics. But even with aromas, look at the term. I think it's myrophore. But in ancient Greece, there were the women who bore the myrrh, the aromatic myrrh, and so there's a lot of wisdom there too. And that I'm hopeful that. One of the things I'm hopeful for I mentioned the Psychedelic Alpha newsletter 2 years ago. Investment in psychedelic companies was really high, and it's dropped off since. And to me, that's a good sign. It's like that the capitalist pressures are looking for other targets. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but I think these treatments are really important. It's just that the way that, people say we shouldn't call it a psychedelic renaissance, because a renaissance for whom? And again, the Renaissance in Europe was a renaissance for whom exactly? There was the plague. Lots of people were living in poverty and disease. So I think I like what's happening, even though I have no idea what's really going to happen in 6 or 12 months or 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Florian, thank you so much. I feel like we want to stick to our time and come to a close.
Yes.
I want to say a couple things, just that you feel like a very important voice in these times as a kind of a bridge, being a medical doctor and obviously an academic history, to come with these ideas of soul to soul connection. And I love this, what you said about it's not so much what the scent does, but what the scent knows. This is something I'm really going to take with me. And this idea of the ecodelic, this is also something that I'm going to take with me. And I feel like our community here, thank you all for being here, our small little ecodelic community that we created for this time, gain great benefit from being in your presence and hearing your wisdom for this evening fireside chat. And yes, I'm going to give you a chance if you want to have a final word, and then I'll close us together. Is there anything else, Florian?
No, I just want to thank you again. I loved our circle, and I think the plants brought us together, and I'm really grateful. Laura, Kevin, Meredith, Ronnie. It's, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I'm really grateful for the wonderful, deep discussion and the feedback. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. We're very grateful for your willingness to be here with us, and grateful for all of you, grateful for the staff for putting this together. And stay tuned for more, and have a beautiful rest of your evening.
Thank you.